The world knows him as the silent architect of some of the most soul-shaking guitar riffs in history. Yet behind the shadow of the stage lights, Jimmy Page has carried a secret so heavy that for decades, even the closest of friends, family, and fans could not have imagined the toll it took. In the hushed corners of his sprawling estate in England, where the walls are lined with memories and instruments that witnessed both triumph and tragedy, he has, at 80, finally allowed himself to speak, revealing a truth that has haunted him through decades of fame, excess, and the unrelenting pressures of genius. The story begins not with Led Zeppelin's monumental performances or chart-topping hits, but with the trembling of a man who has lived through a lifetime of shadows and regrets. In the early years, before the electric storms of Led Zeppelin, Jimmy was a young man with wide eyes and a restless heart. Born into post-war England, his home was modest, yet the music of his father's record player filled every crevice of his imagination. He quickly discovered that the strings of a guitar could speak words his own lips could not. By the time he formed the Yardbirds and later ascended to Led Zeppelin, there was a price to pay. A price that he kept hidden even from the woman who would later become the center of his private life. Stories have long whispered of the excesses: drugs, late-night recording sessions that blurred into mornings, and encounters with figures whose names now glitter in the annals of rock history, people like Brian Jones, Jimi Hendrix, and Robert Plant, who all shared the intoxicating dance of fame and chaos. Yet beneath the bravado, a fragile human trembled with fear and guilt, quietly asking questions no one dared to speak aloud. The first crack in his armor appeared in the late 1970s, after the death of John Bonham. It wasn't just the loss of a bandmate, it was the awakening of an unbearable truth. Jimmy admitted to himself in private diaries, locked away, and only discovered by a trusted archivist years later, that his own choices, his own indulgences, had indirectly fed a darkness he could never undo. He confessed that he had ignored signs, pushed people away, and allowed the destructive currents of rock and roll to sweep innocent souls into chaos. He wrote about nights where he would sit alone in candlelit rooms, replaying phone calls, conversations, missed moments, and imagining the different outcomes. If only he had acted sooner, if only he had spoken. These writings, once thought lost, reveal a man wrestling with self-recrimination so profound it became almost spiritual, almost confessional, like a monk penitent for sins he could never speak aloud in public. By the 1980s, Jimmy's brilliance was often overshadowed by whispers of scandal. There were unverified tales that made tabloid headlines, mysterious visits, long flights to obscure locations, late-night calls from people who would vanish without explanation. The public never saw the late-night breakdowns, the moments when he would wake drenched in sweat, guitar at his side, staring into the darkness and hearing the echoes of decisions that had left friends and family in pain. Even his children, whom he adored yet often neglected due to the demands of music and personal demons, felt the sting of his absence. Conversations with Robert Plant, recounted in recently uncovered interviews, hinted at Jimmy's profound loneliness. Plant's words, clipped and hesitant, spoke of a man whose musical genius masked a haunted soul, a soul burdened by love lost, mistakes made, and the realization that fame is often a cage gilded with gold. Gilded with gold. As the 1990s approached, the weight of decades began to manifest physically. Jimmy, once tireless on stage, started showing signs of illness, persistent fatigue, ailments that puzzled even seasoned doctors, and a growing sense of fragility that his closest friends rarely witnessed. It was during this time, while working on obscure side projects, that he made what he now describes as the hardest confession of all, that his relentless pursuit of perfection and the allure of excess had cost lives, joy, and genuine connection. In private, he would replay moments in which a simple word, a gesture, or a presence might have changed a trajectory. But he remained silent until now, waiting, perhaps, for the weight of years to give him courage. Even as Led Zeppelin's legend grew into myth, Jimmy Page lived a dual life, the godlike performer adored by millions, and the solitary man tormented by the ghost of choices made. Family letters, unseen photographs, and recordings from backstage reveal the tension. Smiles captured for the cameras, while behind the scenes, his hands would shake, eyes darting to the shadows, and mind wrestling with the growing realization that fame is ephemeral, but guilt endures forever. Only now, in the twilight of his life, has he revealed the unthinkable, a truth that ties together decades of mystery, whispered rumors, and unexplained absences. It is a revelation that some feared, yet others sensed, lurking beneath the celebrated riffs and epic solos. Beloved, what Jimmy Page revealed next is a truth that trembles with heartbreak and horror, a revelation that casts a long shadow over the myth of Led Zeppelin. In a private recording, his voice is low, almost brittle, carrying decades of suppressed emotion. He speaks of a person he loved dearly, someone who had always been at the periphery of his fame, always silently supporting him, yet one who suffered quietly because of his own blind pursuit of greatness. For years, the public imagined Jimmy as untouchable, a god of guitar, but behind closed doors, he was grappling with regret so profound it altered the very rhythm of his life. He admitted that his relentless touring, obsession with perfection, and bouts of self-destructive behavior created ripples of pain that no apology could ever fully mend. He spoke of nights in Paris and New York, hotel rooms soaked with rain, and letters he never sent, letters that chronicled a man desperate to rewrite moments that had already passed irretrievably. There were encounters that only now are coming to light. Jimmy recalls late-night meetings with other rock legends, Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck, and even David Bowie, where music and camaraderie intermingled with confessions, each man silently aware of the cost of their own genius. One story in particular haunts him still, a recording session that ended in tragedy, where an unspoken argument, a dismissed warning, and a moment of hubris combined in a way he could never have anticipated. The aftermath was a quiet disaster, swept under the rug by managers, lawyers, and PR teams, but it left scars on friends, colleagues, and Jimmy himself that no number of sold-out arenas could ever heal. He described lying awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining the consequences of his actions like a slow-motion film, each frame a tormenting echo of things he could never undo. Never undo. Jimmy also revealed a secret struggle with illness that the public never knew. For decades, he had been managing a condition that sapped energy and clarity, a condition that he kept hidden even from his closest confidants. The disease became a metaphor for the weight he carried, unseen, creeping, relentless, much like the guilt that had shadowed every major decision he made in life. Family members, including his children, recall moments when he would vanish for days, retreating into studios or secluded homes, not for creative inspiration, but for escape from a life that had demanded brilliance, but offered little forgiveness. The interviews, private letters, and recordings now revealed show a man confronting mortality with the tremor of someone who knows the clock is ticking, yet still battles the ghosts of the past. There are confessions about friendships lost, bonds severed, and love that he failed to nurture. People close to him recount moments of abrupt silence, sudden departures, and phone calls left unanswered, all woven into a tapestry of regret. Even relationships with fellow musicians were often strained. Behind the camaraderie, Jimmy struggled to reconcile the person he was with the legend the world revered. It is said that Robert Plant, in conversations now resurfacing, once described Jimmy as a man who could move mountains with a guitar but could not scale the heights of his own conscience. These words, once brushed off by the public as poetic exaggeration, now resonate with haunting clarity. Perhaps the most painful revelation is one that strikes at the very heart of human connection. Jimmy confessed to having avoided conversations that mattered most, words unsaid to his children, apologies never made, and embraces withheld. He speaks of a particular night in 1992, a night that remained locked in his memory like a secret chamber, where a loved one confronted him, desperate for honesty and presence. He failed them. The memory, once fleeting, has now become an indelible mark on his conscience, one he has carried silently for nearly 4 decades. It is this human fragility, this quiet torment, that transforms the story from legend into something profoundly, painfully real. Legendary, Jimmy Page's revelations grow darker as he recounts the years when fame was no longer a celebration, but a cage. The 1990s and early 2000s were marked not by the glory of sold-out arenas or platinum albums, but by long stretches of isolation, punctuated by anxiety and a gnawing sense of inevitability. He describes wandering through empty corridors of stately London homes, surrounded by instruments that once sang with life, now silent witnesses to his internal torment. Friends who visited often noticed the same thing. The sparkle in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by a cautious, haunted gaze that flinched at the slightest noise or unexpected knock. Even celebrated collaborations with musicians like Steve Vai and Joe Bonamassa could not lift the weight pressing down on him, a weight born of decisions made decades earlier, decisions that had left unseen casualties in their wake. In one harrowing passage, Jimmy confesses a confrontation with mortality that changed him forever. During a routine medical checkup, a doctor quietly informed him that years of stress, indulgence, and self-neglect had created conditions that could no longer be ignored. The diagnosis was serious, the type that forces a man to confront the fragile line between legacy and life itself. It was in those hospital rooms surrounded by sterile white walls and the soft hum of machines that he began to reckon fully with the human consequences of his choices. And yet what he describes next is the most private confession of all. He realized that no amount of fame, no number of records sold, could erase the pain he had caused, pain that lingered in the faces of estranged family members, former collaborators, and friends who had quietly borne the brunt of his ambition. The darkness of the past also returned in the form of long-buried regrets, the kind that fester quietly until the mind is forced to reckon with them. Jimmy speaks of a night in Los Angeles long after Led Zeppelin's dissolution when he encountered a figure from his early career who bore the scars of his neglect. Words were exchanged, bitter and raw, and for the first time Jimmy admitted that he could not fix what had been broken. It was a turning point, a realization that fame had granted him immortality in music, but left him mortal in every other aspect of life. From that point onward, he says, his days became a careful balance between redemption and recollection, each moment a struggle to reconcile his public persona with the private man who had caused invisible wounds. There are confessions about the secret obsessions that haunted him in the quiet hours. Jimmy details how certain melodies, riffs, and chord progressions were tied to memories of lost opportunities and regrets. Every note he played was, in part, a conversation with ghosts, reminders of people he failed, promises he neglected, and moments where his silence had consequences far beyond what he had imagined. The emotional toll, he says, is something few could comprehend. Even his longtime associates, such as engineer Eddie Kramer, noticed how Jimmy would sometimes break down during recording sessions, overwhelmed not by technical difficulties, but by the weight of his own conscience. It was as if every guitar string carried the echo of decades of remorse, vibrating with the sounds of decisions that could never be undone. In recounting these years, Jimmy's voice softens, and the confessions become almost ritualistic. He reveals the private ways he tried to atone: late-night charity work, mentorship of younger musicians, quiet acts of kindness to those overlooked in the industry. But he admits, with raw honesty, that these gestures could never fully bridge the gaps created by his past choices. Family gatherings were often awkward, punctuated by unspoken tensions, missed birthdays, and strained conversations. Even as he achieved legendary status on stage, the man off stage was living a different reality, a reality marked by isolation, regret, and the haunting knowledge that some wounds never heal. Respected, the revelations deepen as Jimmy Page reflects on the intimate losses that fame had demanded of him, losses that few could have foreseen. In his private journals, now partially released to historians with his blessing, he writes of friendships dissolved by pride and secrecy, of romances that ended abruptly not through betrayal but through neglect, and of children who grew up with the shadow of a father who was both present and absent at once. He confesses to missing crucial moments: birthdays, graduations, quiet dinners, while chasing tours, recording sessions, or fleeting inspirations that seemed eternal in the moment but left nothing tangible behind. The sorrow is palpable in his words, a slow-burning grief that even the most thunderous applause could never drown. Never drown.